Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. The House of Hanover is perhaps most famous for not getting on with each other. I mean, the Georgian monarchs fell out with their parents, their children, their siblings and their wives. Within this particular familial soap opera, there are, frankly, some pretty unlikable characters. I mean, arguably none of them really comes out smelling of roses, so to speak. However, if there were to be a standout superstar of this royal house, at least so far as I'm concerned, then it's got to be Caroline of Ansbach. She's the wife of King George II, she is my favourite, and I want to tell you about her today. But before we take a look at today's topic, I want to say an absolutely massive thank you to History Hit for sponsoring another video on this channel. This week, I have really enjoyed learning more about Queen Victoria's favourite Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, and particularly about the place that he called home.
So, how on earth did he do it? How did this outsider become Prime Minister? In this documentary, I'm getting to the heart of how Disraeli climbed to the very top. A story which is rooted in his own house in the countryside, which was a backdrop for political drama, royal visits, and an enduring love story. This is the making of Queen Victoria's favourite, the story of Disraeli. The story of Jouvenet.
I loved this documentary and I know that you will too. History Hit brings you the stories that shape the world through their award-winning online history channel and podcast network. It's like Netflix, but it's all history. Watch hundreds of hours of original history documentaries anywhere, anytime, on any device. Brought to you by expert historians such as Dan Snow, Professor Susanna Lipscomb, Dan Jones, and more. And as well as already having hundreds of expert-led programmes, they add 2 more every week. Click the link in my description box to find out more and to subscribe to History Hit. As an added bonus, History Hit are offering my viewers a very special discount. If you use the code READINGTHEPAST30 at checkout, you will get 30% off of an annual subscription. Thanks again to History Hit for sponsoring this video. But now, let's take a look at the life of Caroline of Ansbach. Before the world shut down in 2020, as part of my job as a costumed historical interpreter, I was spending my time at Kensington Palace. I was dressed in a mantua gown and representing Caroline of Ansbach. While I was doing so, I was just having the best time, and I really did love getting to know Caroline in this way. And so I am willing to accept that this particular experience has no doubt contributed to my enduring affection for this lady. I'm not going to say she's perfect or that she was a saint, but I still really do like her. Caroline was born in the Palace of Ansbach in South Germany on the 1st of March 1683. She was her parents' first child. When she was 3 years old, her father, Johann Friedrich, died. Caroline's mother, Eleanor, remarried in 1692, and she and her children thus had to relocate to join her new husband. They went to their new home in Dresden. By this point, Caroline was 9 years old. 4 years later, in 1696, Caroline's mother died. So, at 13 years old, Caroline was now an orphan. She was placed in the care of the Elector and Electress of Brandenburg. She moved to live with them at their palace near Berlin. Caroline's level of education before this point is unknown, but it has been suggested that whatever form it may have taken, it would not have been particularly expansive or extensive. If this is in fact the case, then at the court of her guardians, Caroline's situation and opportunities would have been wholly transformed. The Electress, Sophia Charlotte, who would become the Queen of Prussia in 1701, was the daughter of another Sophia, Sophia of Hanover, and I have made a video on her which I will be leaving linked. Both Sophias were renowned for their intellectual pursuits and for their patronage of some of the greatest minds of their age. Caroline appears to have thrived in this cultured, intellectual environment. As we shall see, it was evidently a formative part of the woman and the queen that she would become. While at Sophia Charlotte's court, Caroline won the favour, admiration and affection of her host, but also of that host's other esteemed guests. Because Caroline didn't simply share space with famed intellectuals, she also began to form friendships of her own with them. Perhaps the most celebrated of these individuals was the polymath Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Before long, discussions regarding Caroline's prospective marriage had begun. The future Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI was an early contender. In many ways, this would have been a fabulous match for Caroline. However, it would necessitate her to convert from Lutheranism to Roman Catholicism. At first, Caroline agreed to do just that, and so a Jesuit priest, Father Orban, was sent to her to aid in her re-education and conversion in 1703. Reportedly, Caroline found this process intolerably upsetting, and so, in 1704, she concluded her dealings with this Jesuit, and thus, any thought of a marriage proposal from Charles promptly went away. Stephen Taylor writes that, quote, "This was an episode of which she was inordinately proud. When, in 1714, John Robinson, Bishop of London, offered to explain to her anything about Anglicanism which she did not fully comprehend, she promptly dismissed him, remarking that he is very impertinent to suppose that I, who refused to be empress for the sake of the Protestant religion, don't understand it." This narrative of Caroline as Protestant heroine would become very useful to the man that she would ultimately marry. He was George Augustus, the Electoral Prince of Hanover, who, following the 1701 Act of Settlement, was the future King of England and Ireland, and thus also the future head of the Church in England. At least he was after his grandmother and his father would have had a go. The later Act of Union of 1707 would make him the future King of Great Britain and Ireland. George paid Caroline a visit in the June of 1705. At the start of that year, Caroline's world had been turned upside down again following the death of Sophia Charlotte. Caroline was 22 years old. She had, as we know, been orphaned in her early teens, and now she had lost another beloved female figure. Perhaps, though, George's visit provided her with a distraction or some comfort in her grief. After all, Sophia Charlotte was his aunt. He was certainly taken with Caroline. He would marry her on the 22nd of August 1705 in the chapel at Herrenhausen Palace in Hanover. This was Caroline's new marital home. The marriage was, for the most part, a very happy one. George and Caroline's first child, Frederick, was born on the 20th of January 1707. Indeed, Caroline would have at least 9 pregnancies, and out of those 9 pregnancies, 7 of her children would survive into adulthood. Not long after Frederick's birth, Caroline contracted smallpox and pneumonia, both of which, as I'm sure we are aware, could easily have proved fatal to her. It has been taken as a sign of her husband's true affection for her that George chose to care for her himself during this most dangerous period. He helped to nurse her back to health. And a recovered Caroline would find much to enjoy and to edify her in Hanover. She had for company, for example, her husband's grandmother, Sophia, who was another great supporter of celebrated thinkers, as her daughter, Sophia Charlotte, had been. I mean, it had, after all, been the mother that had influenced the daughter in the first place. While Sophia waited to become Queen of Great Britain and Ireland, her court in Hanover was fertile ground for philosophers, scientists, and artists. This was a world that Caroline would have, by this point, felt very comfortable in, and Sophia would only encourage Caroline's various interests further. In addition to interrogating the pressing questions of the day and of all time with Leibniz, Caroline was increasingly invested in being as prepared as possible for her future in Britain. She worked on her grasp of the English language. She sought to deepen her understanding of the political situation in Britain so that she could better engage in interventions that might ensure a smooth transition of power from the Stuarts to the Hanoverians. And she also set about creating a network of educated and politically useful female friends who would be able to accompany her and serve as her court in Britain when the time came. One of these friends was Henrietta Howard, who almost certainly deserves a video of her own. Henrietta was appointed to be one of Caroline's ladies-in-waiting while they were still in Hanover, and she would remain in Caroline's favour, despite the fact that she would soon become the mistress of George Augustus. Some have suggested that Caroline's husband only took a mistress because it was the expected thing for a person in his position to do. Indeed, one of Caroline's court favourites, Lord Hervey, reported that many courtiers doubted George of, quote, ever having entered into any commerce with her, that he might not innocently have had with his daughter. Nevertheless, and despite these protestations, their relationship was certainly a sexual one, and it was one that apparently Caroline supported. According to Lord Hervey, she did support it because she knew that her own influence over her husband would always outstrip that of this particular mistress. Events moved swiftly in 1714. Caroline was present on the 8th of June 1714 when her grandmother-in-law, Sophia, collapsed while walking in the gardens of Herrenhausen. Sophia of Hanover, the recognised heir of the last Stuart monarch, Queen Anne, had died before she'd got the chance to inherit. Less than 2 months later, on the 1st of August 1714, Queen Anne herself died. Now, Caroline's father-in-law was the King of Great Britain. King George I and his son, Caroline's husband, travelled to England the next month, with Caroline following them in the October. By this point, Caroline had given birth to 4 children, 3 girls and that first boy, Frederick. Frederick was 7 years old in 1714. George I commanded that Frederick be left behind in Hanover to represent the family. All the while, his grandfather, parents and sisters would move to become the British royal family. Frederick was educated for his expected future as King of Great Britain. He was referenced in the dynastic iconography of his grandfather, and as he grew older, he was kept informed of the political situation in the realm that his family was now ruling. Nevertheless, it would be 14 years before Frederick would actually come to England, and 14 years before he would be with his parents again. By that point, of course, Frederick had become a man with his own ideas, which would frequently put him at odds with his parents, Caroline and George. Of course, family strife was not new territory for either Caroline or George, because the relationship between them and King George I was also incredibly strained. The new Prince and Princess of Wales looked to be fairly successful in courting the favour of the British public. King George I responded to this by attempting to push them into the background. Things finally came to a head at the baptism of this couple's next surviving child, George William, in November 1717. At this baptism, the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Newcastle got into a verbal altercation. The Prince of Wales reportedly called Newcastle a, quote, rascal and promised to, quote, find him. He said this, though, in a fairly thick German accent. Newcastle, perhaps deliberately, misheard, and claimed that there had been a challenge to a duel. Find him became fight him. The king thus exiled his son from court. Caroline, in solidarity and much to George I's surprise apparently, followed her husband, even though her doing so required her to leave her children, including their baby George William, behind. When this little boy died the next year, in 1718, his parents were, I think naturally, the focus of public sympathy. George I would allow Caroline to visit her surviving children on a daily basis. She played with them, spent time with them while they ate, and put them to bed. Caroline also was working behind the scenes. She was using her substantial skills in an attempt to influence these matters. She was responsible for opening negotiation with the King's ministers and with Robert Walpole in order to try and find a way to mend this rift. She did all of this without either the approval or the knowledge of her husband or her father-in-law. There would eventually be a reconciliation between the king and Caroline and George in 1720, but despite this, the children would remain in the household and custody of their grandfather. Caroline and George would, however, go on to have one more son and two more daughters, and those children would stay with their parents. Against this backdrop of familial conflict, Caroline continued in her customary intellectual pursuits and also in her support for new ideas. In the 1720s, Caroline threw her support behind Lady Mary Wortley Montagu when she was promoting the value of variolation against smallpox. Caroline supported the experimental use of this procedure on inmates at Newgate, all of whom survived the experience and were then released. Caroline even convinced her father-in-law, the king, to allow her daughters, Caroline and Amelia, to be variolated in 1722. I do have a video on Montagu and her work, which I will be leaving linked as well. In the June of 1727, King George I had returned to Germany. While he was there, he was taken suddenly ill and quickly died. Caroline and her husband were now the King and Queen Consort of Great Britain. There are many contemporary accounts that seem to position Caroline's political influence as being very great. Lord Harvey described her power as, quote, unrivalled and unbounded. He claimed that she, quote, directed everything, either at home or abroad. Satirical verses were created that alleged that Caroline was the one who really ruled, and she was also the focus of some blame and public demonstrations in response to certain unpopular political changes. Now, George II certainly discussed political matters with his brilliant, intelligent and astute wife. He was, no doubt, happy to take her advice and was, I'm sure, frequently influenced by her opinions. Certainly, when he was out of the country, it was Caroline who was left as his regent. But it was George that was king, and we have no evidence to suggest that he was anything other than diligent in this role. George was, though, also willing to delegate. If we cast our minds back to that early suitor for Caroline's hand in marriage, we will of course remember that she refused to convert to the Roman Catholic faith, even though that meant that she would miss out on becoming an empress. This was, as we heard, an act that Caroline took great pride in and something that she promoted as evidence of her commitment to the Protestant cause. So with this in mind, I think that it was fitting that George allowed his wife to have incredible influence over the ecclesiastical matters of his nation. Indeed, Stephen Taylor explains that, quote, Caroline exerted herself vigorously, playing a crucial role in the appointment of at least 4, and possibly as many as 8 of the 13 bishops consecrated between 1727 and 1737. Caroline should also, arguably, get the credit for the continued survival of this collection of Holbein sketches. Now, we have looked at some examples from this collection in a video on this channel already, which I will be leaving linked. Apparently, Caroline had located these sketches while she was rifling through a bureau, and she had ordered that they should be displayed. If she had not done this, I do think it's fair for us to question whether any of these sketches would still be extant for us to enjoy today. Queen Caroline, a principled Protestant heroine, a friend and promoter of intellectuals and their work, an active participant in the rolling out of the life-saving scientific advancement of variolation, and a chief preserver of some of my very favourite works of art. Perhaps the reasons as to why I hold such particular esteem for this queen are now becoming clear. I am looking forward to seeing if you are starting to feel the same way about her now too. However, we have not reached the end of her story. There is yet more to come. Caroline and George's relationship with their eldest son, Frederick, the Prince of Wales, was not good. They sought to curtail his capacity to gain popularity and influence, in many ways in much the same fashion as George I had done with them. They limited his access to funds. Frederick chafed in response, and so sought to involve himself with opposition politicians. He felt slighted when his father overlooked him, in favour of his mother, to be the regent when the king was out of the country. So Frederick picked fights with his mother during her last period as regent in 1736. Indeed, during that time, it seemed that his sole hope was to cause her offence. 1736 was also the year that Frederick became a husband, when he married Augusta on the 27th of April in the Chapel Royal at St James's Palace. Less than a year later, this newlywed couple would do something that would incur the deep displeasure of the king and queen. Frederick and Augusta were awaiting the birth of their first child. It was the expectation at the time that births with this kind of royal dynastic significance would be properly witnessed. The Prince and Princess of Wales were staying with his royal parents at their palace of Hampton Court. While there, Augusta went into labour on the evening of the 31st of July, 1737. Frederick responded in a completely composed and normal way by sneaking his labouring wife out of the palace, putting her into a carriage and transporting her to St James's. Just as a reminder, the roads were not always great then. I cannot imagine this would have been comfortable or safe for a labouring woman. Nevertheless, it was at St James's that their daughter was born, and she was born within hours. George and Caroline were furious. They barred Frederick from their court and presence, and it didn't look like forgiveness was going to be forthcoming. The relationship was heavily strained. Indeed, Lord Hervey reported that when Caroline saw Frederick walking through St James's, she exclaimed, quote, "Look, there he goes, that wretch, that villain. I wish the ground would open this moment and sink the monster to the lowest hole in hell." Just over 3 months after that late-night labouring flight from Hampton Court, on the 9th of November 1737, Caroline began to complain of abdominal pain. I'm just going to pause briefly to flag up that what we're about to talk about next, the discussion that's going to be happening, may not be suitable if you are squeamish or if intestine stuff makes you uncomfortable. If you are someone who watches my videos while you're eating, the rest of this video is not the one for that. You can eat or you can watch it. I would not recommend doing both at the same time. That is the warning. I'm going to give you time to decide what you want to do before we move on to start talking about it now. It is thought that Caroline developed a hernia during her pregnancy with her last surviving child, Louisa, back in 1724. For reasons that aren't eminently clear to us today, she then chose to conceal this issue and the pain that it no doubt caused her, at least at some points. But then, over a decade later, it is thought that too much of her bowel had managed to herniate through this tear. that it had then become stuck and that it perhaps had begun to strangle and die, which perhaps explains the pain that she can now not ignore. We believe that royal surgeons made an incision in her abdomen and saw this protrusion that was emanating from the Queen's abdominal muscles. They identified it to be the source of her pain. Now, had they pushed this protrusion back through, maybe sutured the muscles, it's highly likely that her problems would have been solved, at least temporarily. Instead, we think they either left it as they found it, or perhaps more likely, they intervened. They snipped the lump off. This, of course, means that they severed Caroline's bowel. They then would have sewn her up. Caroline was reportedly, and I think understandably, in a massive amount of pain. Her husband remained with her. He frequently slept on the floor of her room. She was visited by members of her family and by the churchmen whose careers she had most promoted and whom she liked the best. They prayed with her for days as she lay dying. Her eldest son, Frederick, was, however, denied an audience with his mother. Caroline died on the 20th of November, 1737. She was buried on the 17th of December, 1737, in the new vault that had been constructed on the orders of her husband in Henry VII's Lady Chapel in Westminster Abbey. George II would be buried beside his wife on the 11th of November, 1760. He ordered that the sides of their coffins should be removed to allow their remains to mingle with each other in death. So what do you think of the life and legacy of Caroline of Ansbach, of her influence and how she used it, of her interests and pursuits? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video. I'd also love it if you would pop an emoji or a social glyph, as we're calling them now, in the comments, because the more engagement a video gets, the more YouTube decides to share it out, and that will help us to grow this community. So for emojis or social glyphs, let's do something royal this time. You can find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to all of the places you can find me on the internet in my description box. Please do follow me over on some or all of those so that we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, please do share it with your friends. In fact, if you like the channel, let your pals know about it. That way you'll have more people to talk about history with in real life too. You can let me know you like this particular video by hitting the thumbs up. I'd love it if you would subscribe to the channel, and if you think you're subscribed, maybe have a little check now, make sure that YouTube hasn't mysteriously unsubscribed you against your will, and while you are there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, please hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop down menu that will appear, and that way YouTube says that allegedly they will let you know when I've next uploaded, or indeed when I am planning to go live. I hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.